Hello, welcome to my channel once again. Today is a little bit of a break from 3D printing and playing with toxic chemicals, and I'm going to approach an equally toxic subject. In this case, magic in science fiction. Now, before you call me crazy, it did take me a while to get to this. I was working on a book during lockdown, and I was thinking, okay, this would be like a generation ship, and they're 20 years from Earth, and they're 20 years from where they're going, and the people who were born on board are now old enough that they're starting to take over stuff. I had orbital projections worked out. I was working on deck plans and general arrangements drawings. I had sketches and diagrams and all the engineering stuff worked out. I was producing the rocket equations, population models, and at the end of the day, what I was finding was that all these numbers didn't help me figure out how they solve problems on a day to day basis. We have no idea on a lot of these things. We don't know how crops will grow. We don't know if people can reproduce. I was finding myself going out further and further on a limb, and my story was getting more and more boring the more and more I had to solve problems using today's technology. And every time I went to go open a door to solve a problem, I found myself increasingly going, what would I do in a fantasy setting? So tonight I'm going to present the controversial magic chromodynamics system. This is a universal magic system that's designed to apply a lot of the tropes that we've seen in fantasy to science fiction. Now, some people are already arguing, no, you can't have magic in sci-fi. Well, you do. You really do. Because for a book to be interesting, it has to take us away from reality. Reality is boring. Every story needs something that takes us out of that reality and puts us into the setting. That is what I will refer to as magic. And every story has magic. Romantic comedies have magic. Action movies have magic. Sci-fi has magic. Fantasy has magic. Now, we think, okay, well, fantasy, it's magic and dragons and bootstrappy adventurers. And sci-fi is science and aliens who are totally not dragons. And stoic intellectuals who are completely different from our bootstrappy adventurers. And that there's this number line where science fiction sits here on this extreme, and like elves and dragons sit on this extreme, and then we get Star Wars. So science, it's in a galaxy far, far away. And fantasy, oh, this is long, long ago. And you start to realize that if you follow these two extremes, eventually they meet up on the other side. It's not a line, it's a circle. And what we realize is that the distinction between sci-fi and fantasy is not that you don't have, basically the story is sci-fi or it's fantasy. It's more the collection of tropes that they drape all the storytelling elements in. Star Trek. We have hand phasers. Hand phasers have many different powers, but they allow somebody who is just an ordinary human to kill, to stun. They can set it to overload and explode like a grenade. And in one episode, they used it to heat coffee. And then in a fantasy setting, you've got the wand. It can kill if you use the Avocadabra spell. It can stun if you use the stupefy spell. It explodes like a hand grenade if you use the Confringio spell. And it even has a flashlight function. But you know what else has a flashlight function? Okay, well, let's do an urban fantasy here. We've got a smartphone. It stuns. Oh, yeah, that's kind of like social media. You know, if you don't plug it in right, it does explode like a hand grenade. It has a flashlight application. And unlike all those other things, it provides instant communication, although at this point it doesn't kill anybody. And then you start looking at, well, what are the tropes that do that in other science fiction and fantasy genres? And you realize that, oh, well, the smartphone kind of sits in the middle between a communicator that just communicates and a palentier, which, while it communicates, it also connects you into the surveillance state. And oddly enough, the smartphone is kind of in between something that just communicates and puts us in touch with the surveillance state. This idea that there's magic in sci-fi is not original to me. It goes back to the great masters. Arthur C. Clarke, the guy who wrote probably some of the hardest sci-fi out there, had his three laws, and the most famous of the three was that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So let's not think of the dichotomy that's not really there between sci-fi and fantasy as a number line. It's more like we have expanding spheres of plausibility. So if I'm telling you what happened to me at lunch, well, you kind of expect that kind of story to be bounded in reality. If I'm telling a joke or I'm speculating on something, you kind of know that the laws of physics and causality might be a little bent. If I'm spinning a tale, that's in the realm of fiction. You know none of it's real, but it still has to kind of make sense. And beyond that's the realm of mystery, the stuff that actually shouldn't make sense after a while. And if we got the idea that, we've got expanding rings of believability, then we also realize that the difference between mystery and science and action movies and things is more the direction that these mystical elements pull from. Now, I realize a color wheel isn't 100% useful for the human population because a lot of people don't see color the same way. So I'm going to borrow a bit from trigonometry, and we'll also express these ideas that our direction of magic is just like a direction on a compass. But to be compatible with trigonometry we learned in school, our north will be aligned along the x-axis. And that allows us to use the sine function and the cosine function. For those of you who barely passed math and I'm dragging up horrible memories, have no fear. It's not important. But for those who can't tell the difference between green and red or yellow and blue, you can use this circle and compass idea to fall back on to help develop these relationships between the different directions of magic that we're going to be discussing later. So think of our everyday life as like the color gray. Gray isn't green, it isn't blue, it isn't red, it isn't cyan. It's just this kind of lumpy mess. And to become a color, it has to take on what we in the industry call saturation. So grays in the middle and bright and vivid colors are on the outside, and we've got an infinite number of shades in between. Now, once we get out to the edge, we've got every color in the rainbow, and they kind of go around in a circle. And if you go far enough around, you end up at basically back at the original color. So if you go, left from red, you'll eventually end up back at fuchsia. And if you go in the other direction, you'll end up back at orange. Now, not every story involves out of this world sort of skills, and different characters have different ability. So let's go out to our first level of magic, and I call these mundane abilities. They're not really magic. It's more like somebody's got a knack for something. These are skills that people can do. We can't quite explain why somebody's better at them than others, but there are things that you've probably experienced in real life. That guy in high school who was just unnaturally good at picking combination locks, or somebody who's good at cards, or good at throwing a baseball. They're good at these things, and we believe that, well, they must have built a skill or something, but we don't know how to do it, and thus, to us, what they do is magic. It's not magic. It's just, something that they can do that I can't. Now, there's a tabletop game called Fate Accelerated, and they introduced the idea that there are 6 ways of solving a problem. Not that this is a perfect mapping of the world, but for storytelling purposes, these 6 kind of encompass most of what we would need a character in a story to do. So those 6 approaches are forceful, and this is the kind of stuff that requires brute strength and ignorance. It's staring down a monster. It's withstanding the pain, or lifting the immovable object, or some athletic skill that they spent their lifetime developing. In other tabletops, this would be similar to strength checks in Dungeons and Dragons. Quick skills are things that require split-second timing and dexterity, and probably a little bit of luck. So your lockpicking, your disarming bombs, your sleight of hand tricks, and those are where you start doing dex checks in D&D. Careful are tasks that require finding, basically attention to detail and focus. So in a detective story, it's that guy who can spot the clue, or in another story, it's somebody who can pick a face out in a crowd, or in another story, it's somebody who can listen to an interrogation and go, wait, that story doesn't add up. And those would be the equivalent of wisdom checks in D&D. Sneaky are solutions that require misdirection, stealth, and deceit. So it's your ninja skills, your masters of disguise, the kind of person who can just hide in plain sight. And D&D kind of mixes these up between intelligence and dexterity. We won't get into the weeds with that here, but I'm just trying to give you the big picture. Clever is things that require rational thought and problem solving. So decoding a message, or diagnosing a machine that's broken, or seeing the flaw in your enemy's plans. These are what would normally be an intelligence check in D&D. Flashy is where the character being the center of attention is what makes the effect go off. So delivering an inspirational speech, or staging a performance, or flirting, or bluffing, or intimidation. These are all charisma checky things in D&D. Now, beyond the skill or mundane type magic is what I like to call true magic. I am going to use terminology from tropes in video games, and actually mostly tabletop games. So just be consistent. I'm going to use the terms from D&D, but it, these are transcendental concepts. They're not specific to D&D, and by the end of it, I'm just going to go with the name of the color, and we're just going to have to just agree to disagree on what other meaning comes beyond that. What I do is I kind of take the 6 approaches from Fate and I plus them to give us 6 schools of magic from D&D. So our forceful becomes evocation. So everything past forceful is channeling supernatural energy through your body. You kind of resist damage. You take on super strength. You can shoot lightning from your hands. Conjuration is our extension of quick. It's what allows you to teleport or to manipulate probability or to have such a supernatural reaction time that you can be ahead of before somebody even swings at you. Divinity is extrasensory perception. You can see things that other people can't see. You have access to knowledge that nobody can explain how you know it. You are connected to all things, and that's why you get the big picture. Illusion extends sneaky. It allows you to actively manipulate the perception of other people. You can become invisible. You can take on shapes of, you can take on the appearance of somebody else. You can glamour to make somebody believe something looks like something it doesn't. You can cast illusions and hallucinations and otherwise warp how other people are seeing the world. Transmutation physically transforms things. So alchemy and shape-shifting and moving things with your mind through telekinesis. Enchantment is imposing your will on the universe and others. It allows you to create these elaborate curses with weird clauses and whatnot. It's your mind control magic and the sort of thing that you can create lasting enchantments with, again, these elaborate rules. Now, hardcore Dungeons and Dragons fans might be going, well, wait a minute, no, there's not 6 schools of magic in D&D, there's 8. Well, there's not 6 primary colors. There's a whole spectrum, but we also have these weird colors like white and black. So what if we think of abjuration as the blending of the primary colors of light, red, green, and blue? And in my headcanon, abjuration is anti-magic. It blocks magic, it repels magic, it cancels magic, it banishes supernatural beings. Necromancy combines all the colors of dark, cyan, yellow, and magenta. It manipulates life energy. It breaks the rules. It creates undead. It blurs lines. Now, if we stick with this color model, we end up with a bunch of really intuitive rules for how these different brands of magic interact with each other. So you get the idea of opposites. There are colors, and then the artist will tell you that you just can't mix meaningfully. Yellow and blue are opposite colors. You can't mix them. If you try, you end up with this very weird, and feel free to YouTube this, Stygian blue. It's not a color that your eye can see. Likewise with red and cyan and magenta and green. You can't mix those colors. They're mutually exclusive. You also have the concept of cusps. So you can take 2 colors that are kind of close on the color wheel and pick a color in between. And usually in this magic system, an adjacent light and an adjacent dark color make something that's something in between. And there's complements. You can take 2 light colors and make a dark color. Green and red make yellow. Red and blue make magenta. Blue and green make cyan, but it works in the other direction too. Two darks make a light. Yellow and cyan make green, and cyan and magenta make blue, and magenta and yellow make red. For battle purposes, we can also introduce a kind of like a rock, paper, scissors. So for the light colors, blue beats red, and red beats green, and green beats blue, and it's just you kind of walk around counterclockwise. And then just to twist things up, for the dark colors, we go in the opposite direction. So yellow beats magenta, and cyan, magenta beats cyan, and cyan beats yellow. So the idea is that you can cancel an ability, or a dark ability out with a light ability, or a light ability with a dark ability. But to really beat them, you need to use the nemesis of that color. All right, I'm running pretty long. I've got 52 slides here, so let's just summarize real quick. First off, all stories need magic, whether you call it magic or not. Magic comes in intensity. Magic also comes in direction. Magic that tries to go in every direction ends up canceling out or corrupting. And we can use the color wheel to work out intuitive relationships between directions of magic. I thank you so much for tuning in. I'll have more on these concepts and more as I develop this tabletop game of mine. And thanks again for tuning in.